The Women's Liberation Front is a hate group, pure and simple. And when a hate group comes into town to attack the rights of trans women, it is a women's issue.
Wolf aggressively advocates a sex as gender understanding of human identity that erases trans, intersex, and gender nonconforming people from what we imagine them to be as human.
You all rock.
Trans women are women!
Okay. Everyone, like I stated before, disruptive behavior is not allowed. Okay.
Hey, this is Benjamin Boyce. I went up to Seattle this past weekend to attend the Women's Liberation Front Fighting the New Misogyny speaking panel at the Seattle Public Library, which was proposed, and as soon as word got out that it was happening, a bunch of people tried to stop it from happening because there's these four terribly brilliant women who have the power with speech alone, apparently, to erase the existence of people who have non-gender conforming identities or behaviors. That's not necessarily true, but they were highly vilified, as you see in the snippets of footage that I've already shown. So at this panel, there was Kara Dansky, Lear Keith, and Saba Malik, and of course, Megan Murphy, who I think is my friend. I think it's fair to say she's my friend. And I went up there to attend that event, but I was fortunate enough to have a couple friends come with me, and we filmed the pre-event, which was an anti-wolf event, and then the protest of the wolf event, and then we filmed the wolf event itself. But what I want to do for this video is something manipulative, something masculine, perhaps, or maybe not. I don't know what masculinity has to do with this, but these two groups don't talk to one another because one group, the anti-wolf group, is so dead set on their opinion or their perspective that the wolf group is a hate group, that according to the anti-wolf group, the only proper way of interacting with the wolfies is to shut them down, right? Because they're filled with hate. We can't stand for hate. We can't stand for people erasing other people with words. So these two groups haven't spoken. So what I'm going to do is I'm splicing the pudding. I'm splicing the footage from the anti-wolf event and the wolf event and letting them kind of have a simulated conversation. Now, I kind of want to save my thoughts for another video, and I kind of want to tack my thoughts onto this video, but I will say, I guess in sum, before we dive into the dual speaking, that one similarity that I find quizzical or interesting about both groups is their narrative structure. The narrative structure of both groups is based on oppression. The wolf group is saying that women are oppressed because of their sex, and the trans group is saying that they are oppressed because of their gender. Now, you will be able to make up your mind which group argues their case better, which group actually has a plan to, implement this in a rational way in society, and which group actually has the opposite of rationality on their side when the rubber meets the road. I'll let you guys see that for yourself, but I wonder, and this is just from somebody who's entered this conversation as an observer, more or less as an observer, I just wonder if feminism If it is to survive trans rights activism, it needs to look at itself, see how it based its narrative on oppression, and how basing its narrative on privilege and oppression eventually may or may not have led to the trans rights activists that are now trying to destroy it. I wonder if it's not some sort of chicken and egg babushka doll of activism, and if there is a possibility that gender critical feminism might be able to escape that trajectory, and also if trans rights activism might be able to lay down its swords, whether they be female swords or male swords, lay down their swords and actually move from oppression politic into actually being productive members of society. That all said, let's just dive right in to this dueling event.
So I really have no business or no background in organizing something like this. But as soon as the event was announced at the library, I didn't see anyone else stepping up to organize. So a couple days after, I just put it together. I said, what the heck, why not me? So yeah, I strongly recommend if anyone sees injustice and you don't see anyone stepping up, do it yourself. Even small things. So like, I came here today a little early. I saw there were gender segregated restrooms here, so I just got some printouts, take them over the Two times is a good lifestyle, I recommend it.
This often gets talked about, and you've probably seen it in the media being talked about as a First Amendment issue. And there is the issue about, like, does the library, which is a part of the city, provide spaces to what kind of groups? But the bigger issue that we are pushing today is that even if speech is protected by the First Amendment, it does not need to be made welcome. The First Amendment does not protect anybody from having their speech criticized. And it is important that anytime we see hate, we have a strong vocal condemnation of that hate.
By hosting Wolf, the library not only legitimizes their violent messaging, but also fails to send an important and powerful message that we will use this statement to communicate instead. The existence of trans, intersex, and gender nonconforming people is not debatable in this community.
We must stand with trans people and not allow feminism to be poisoned. I'm thinking there are more of us than them, but I also hope there are those that, I'm still hoping that there are those that we can educate and win over before they get sucked into the transphobe agenda.
We see this anti-trans group that is holding an event in the library, and we see that they are holding events at libraries all across the US and Canada. And we can see what's happening in each of these other cities to get a sense of what their overall goals are. And one of the things that's really clear is that they are trying to provoke a reaction where they can claim that their First Amendment rights are being violated and then paint themselves as the victims. Part of that approach requires us to believe and buy into this false equivalency that says that the people who are criticizing our existence are at the same level as the people who are simply trying to exist. We cannot let this topic be discussed as a both sides issue.
My mother was a librarian. She was. I remember that hallowed day at age 6 when I finally got my own library card. And I don't mean this as a joke. I'm pretty sure that gravitas was similar to what the Catholic kids felt on their first communion. It was that important. My mother loved books. She believed in the power of stories to guide us and the power of ideas to transform us. There's a reason the First Amendment is first. For democracy to work, people need to be able to gather and they need to be able to speak. It really is that simple. My mother was also a feminist. In 1968, the poet Muriel Rukeyser wrote, "What would happen if one woman told the truth about her life? the world would split open. Propelled by collective pain and inchoate rage, women like my mother found the words, saw the pattern, called it political, created theory, and built a movement to liberate women. As for my father, well, my father's people fought off the Nazis to then lose catastrophically to Stalin. My father survived by being a child refugee and then an immigrant. I'm not the only person on this stage tonight whose lineage is a pile of corpses. Given the global horrors of the 20th century, that shouldn't be a surprise. The thing that does surprise me, we, and by that I mean human race we, were supposed to have learned from those horrors. But if you had told me 20 years ago that one day I would not be able to speak in public unless surrounded by a phalanx of armed men, I would not have believed you. We expected authoritarianism from the right. We weren't prepared for it from the left. No, we weren't. So a brief catalog of what the left is doing. Women have lost their jobs. They've lost their publishers. They've lost custody of their kids. They've been threatened so badly they've had to move, and they've been physically assaulted. The most basic facts of biology are now considered a hate crime, which means the reality of women's lives are back to being unspeakable. Children's bodies, especially their future fertility and sexual function, are being destroyed permanently. The worst part is that no one believes us. Civic institutions that were built as bulwark against power are crumbling. Journalists are afraid of losing their jobs, and if that doesn't chill you, nothing will. Academia has fallen, though Hogwarts still stands. And people I counted as friends and comrades just want to keep their heads down so they can keep their jobs, hoping that the fever will break because this can't go on. It can, that's the thing. It can get worse.
Wolf's exclusionary language is a violent tool used to attempt to gain power over the trans community. The goal of their intentionally manipulative messaging is to convince the public that trans people perpetuate rather than suffer violence, and that their existence and empowerment are the source of that violence.
This is one of the signature moves of what I want to call critical race to the bottom theory, which states that the most oppressed can never perpetuate oppression on anybody else. Oppression always runs downhill. So what you end up doing is the oppression Olympics, seeing who can get further down in the totem pole so that you can start flinging shit up. It justifies any punching up, literally in certain cases. If you can say that you are the one who's embattled, then you have the right to punch the turf in this instance. But it doesn't make any sense. And you will see that they use statistics only in one direction to prove, without actually proving a point, that because trans people are the ones who are receiving violence, that there's no possible violence that trans people can perpetuate on women, but they just leave that part out. Now, I want to be political when I say this, so I'm not going to call it stupid, but it's thoroughly steeped in fallacies. And as you might suppose, some fallacies are more phallic than others.
We understand that dehumanizing and villainizing people are intentional strategic precursors to committing violence against them. In working to ban trans, intersex, and gender nonconforming people legally and culturally from what the public understands as human, Wolf hopes to encourage our exclusion and thereby justify harm against us. In the face of this violence, we assert our community is irrefutable. It is an enduring fact. Our existence is ancient and guaranteed.
What I don't understand is why I'm called violent when I have not threatened anyone. I have never called for anyone to be deplatformed or removed from a job simply because they disagree with me ideologically. And yet my disagreement is defined as a form of violence by trans activists. My belief that sex-based rights, which women have fought so hard for, are important and not negotiable, is considered as bad as racism and an attempt to erase trans people. I'm not sure how that's even possible. My disagreement with someone does not erase them. If that were true, none of us would be here, right? Because there's not a single human being alive who doesn't know someone who disagrees with some part of their ideology. I don't like the term cis woman, but if someone calls me a cis woman, it's not violence and it doesn't erase me. I would have had to have an incredibly fragile existence for that to be true. Biological sex is important. Historically, women's biology has been the basis of our oppression since civilization reared its head. We were not oppressed because we performed womanhood in some way or wore certain clothes. We were owned by men. So our sexual and our reproductive capacities could be commodified, as well as our labor. When humans first moved away from hunting, gathering, and they started to practice agriculture, they found that it required a large labor force, and as well as more and more land, right? So tribes who conquered other tribes would kill all the men, and they would keep the women. And they did that because women can reproduce, and a constant supply of workers is necessary. There was the added benefit of women's forced labor and being used for sexual gratification. Women in this country were still chattel as late as the late 19th century, maybe even more. That means that they were owned by their male relatives. I mean, that literally means that they could be bought, sold, won, and lost in card games, and they were. You can look it up, look at it, history. So those hard-won sex-based rights that women before us campaigned for, and in some cases lost their lives for, are incredibly important because they are an acknowledgement that women as a class have suffered immensely at the hands of men as a class.
Women's Liberation Front as an organization and this event at the Seattle Public Library, under the guise of feminism, put forward the dangerous and false idea that the rights of trans people are counterposed to women's rights and that trans people represent a threat to the safety of women. This is the same type of vilification and fear-mongering that is used against people of color, people facing homelessness, and other marginalized groups, and is similarly used to persecute or deny them basic rights. And the facts clearly dispute their claims. All over the world, the trans community is under attack. Between 2008 and 2014, there was 1,612 murders across 62 countries of transgender persons, equivalent to a killing every 2 days. This is no different in the US. The transgender murder rate hit a historic high in the US in 2015, when at least 21 trans women being killed simply for expressing who they are. The majority of these were trans women of color. The true number is almost certainly higher. Trans people are 4 times more likely to live in poverty. 90% of trans people report experiencing harassment, mistreatment, or discrimination on the job. Trans people of color were 6 times more likely to experience physical violence from the police compared to white cisgender survivors and victims.
1 in 4 women experience severe intimate partner physical violence, intimate partner sexual violence, and/or intimate partner stalking with impacts such as injury, fearfulness, post-traumatic stress disorder, and death. 1 in 7 women have been seriously injured by an intimate partner. 1 in 10 women have been raped by an intimate partner. 1 in 4 women have been victims of severe physical violence, for example, beating, burning, or strangling by an intimate partner. These are averages, and the situation is far worse for Black women than for white women. Lesbians are routinely harassed, attacked, and beaten for the sin of being female homosexuals, and today lesbians are being told that they are hateful bigots because they refuse to acknowledge the lie of the female penis. When any of us read, or hear, or speak the statistics that I read above, every single person knows exactly what is meant by the word women. Literally no one is confused by this. Literally every person hearing these words knows exactly what I'm talking about. And yet we have been told that we are not permitted to fight for women and girls as women and girls. The mob awaits us.
The Terf bigotry has creeped into the movement for women's rights. And transphobia and other forms of discrimination only serve to alienate feminists from our natural allies in the fight for liberation. It is important to be aware and speak out against these toxic prejudices which only serve to damage feminism. At the heart of the attacks on trans people is the notion of biological determinism in holding that biology is destiny. This comes from an extreme radical feminist or separatist notion that biology is fixed. This justifies a rigid view of oppression based on gender. But this also excludes other oppressions such as race and class. As social feminists, we recognize multiple oppressions, and we understand that the oppression of, say, a rich white woman is not going to be the same as the oppression of a working class woman of color. Women should not have to just resist, of course, one kind of oppression. We face many struggles. Through this bigotry, the transphobe undermine feminism and actually are setting women's rights back. Trans people have been the strongest leaders for gender equality. They have sought to expand gender expression, which builds women's empowerment and means that we do not have to hold to strict gender roles. Because of their bigotry, the Women's Liberation Front have sunk to the really vile blow of allying themselves with far-right patriarchal organizations.
It seems people are not clamoring to offer space, funding, and security so that feminists can say blasphemous things like men are not women. Despite endless claims online that we're funded by evil right-wing institutions and that we're all getting rich off of all of this, that we're somehow operating from a position of power and privilege rather than from the ground up, the truth is that this is the women's movement. This is feminism, this is women's liberation, and those who are trying to stop us, to shut us down, to shut us up, to have us fired, to terrify us into silence with endless violent threats, who try to bully you all into staying home by screaming misogynist insults in your faces simply for trying to participate in a conversation about women's rights. These are the regressive, backwards, anti-feminist authoritarians. This is the backlash. This is the hate. This is the bigotry, which I like to remind people means intolerance toward those who hold different opinions from oneself. We cannot stop telling and retelling history because history repeats itself when we don't, as we are seeing today, via the so-called trans rights movement. I say so-called because I want to be clear that this isn't about trans rights. There are no rights being fought for trans people within this activism. The activists outside are not fighting to create services and safe spaces for trans-identified people. They're certainly not fighting for the children told they're trans because they like or dislike the color pink, being put on puberty blockers, hormones, and on a path to surgery and sterility.
We've seen bills introduced in half a dozen states and in South Dakota actually moving forward, which would make it a crime for a doctor to prescribe puberty blockers to teenagers. When they are forcing doctors to choose between providing scientifically medical care or jail time, that is way too far. And that is threatening our community, that's threatening our support structures, and specifically targeting our children. This is not okay.
Speaking frankly, if you sterilized yourself, then you're likely not talking about your children, but rather somebody else's children that you are co-opting into your lifestyle.
I want to make one final point here. Lawmakers who take an interest in this topic often say that they want to ban transgender athletes from women's sports, or that they want to ban unnecessary medical procedures for transgender children. These efforts are often well-intentioned, but they're misguided. If there are any lawmakers out there listening, please take note There is simply no such thing as transgender. Gender is a caste system designed to keep women in our place and must be abolished, not enshrined in the law. Women are female, men are male. It's not complicated. In conclusion, women are being fired from our jobs for saying the kinds of things that we are saying here today. This is the new misogyny. It's the same as the old misogyny, but with a postmodern twist. And finally, to paraphrase something that radical feminists often say on the topic of gender, only men could oppress women for thousands of years and then turn around, put on a dress, and claim to be the most marginalized group in society.
Because the different forms of oppression are endemic to the global capitalist system, capitalism needs to maintain oppression in order to perpetuate the brutal exploitation necessary to amass untold wealth for a few. We need a mass movement of working people that can unite across gender and gender identification, race, nationality, and sexual orientation, movements that can fight against oppression and for decent standards of living for all. That is also the lesson of the inspiring history of LGBTQ activism, that we need working people to build united movements.
Speaking as somebody who was in that room, there were not a lot of working class people there. It was actually more people who were students or career activists, people who work for nonprofit organizations, and I think, if I'm correct, a lot of people who seek government assistance in order to maintain a certain standard of living.
I urge everyone here today to join our exciting Tax Amazon 2020 campaign so we can fight for a tax on the largest corporations to fund an expansion of publicly owned, affordable, social housing for working people and a Green New Deal.
The left has become unrecognizable, and we are in terrible freefall, not because we've come unmoored, but because we've been thrown from the movements we've spent our lives building. And for what? For knowing that a woman is an adult human female. I will never stop knowing that. I will never say 5 when the answer is 4.
I'm not being hyperbolic. If we can't define women as adult human females and argue that women share a particular experience in this world and have experienced historical oppression due only to having been born female, there is no basis for women's rights. We cannot defend women's spaces and women's organizing if there's no such thing as a woman, or if a woman is anything anyone says it is, based only on a feeling, an announcement, or an affinity towards uncomfortable shoes and lacy underwear. This is indeed how the second wave began, through consciousness-raising groups, through women getting together and talking about their lives and shared experiences of oppression, harassment, abuse, and other forms of sexism, and realizing, oh, it's not just me, it's all of us, and how do we change this?
Our march leaders, we're going to need some really catchy things to say on the microphones. I want to remind us that while transgender lives do matter, Black Lives Matter has effective ownership over Black Lives Matter, or insert word, Lives Matter. We try to say really powerful and awesome things without saying trans lives matter, unless you're saying Black trans lives matter. I think that one is okay. So thank you for that.
Many Black women and other women of color are in the same boat as myself. We feel isolated, as if we don't have a place in this current feminist movement, particularly the radical feminist movement, because it is still very white-centered. What is Wolf doing to carve out space at the table for women of color to take a seat? Because with the exception of Saba, race hasn't been mentioned by the other speakers. And for me, this is one of the biggest roadblocks for interracial movement building among women.
The concerns that you raised have been raised many times, not just with Wolf, but with a lot of primarily white-led feminist organizations. And Wolf is absolutely committed to dismantling all structures of oppression and power, including the oppression of racism. And Wolf is talking about these things on a regular basis and how we can be better and how we can do better. And I just want to acknowledge that it's a really important problem and we're not shying away from it.
Thank you. My name is Kaylee. I just want to thank you guys for being here. I know how much it's cost you to work alongside conservatives like me. I'm humbled by that, and I am very grateful that you fight for all women. And I want to ask you, as a conservative, what communications traps do you see us falling into all the freaking time that make the work harder for you? Because this is my world, and Carrie, you've been generous enough to call me up and say, Kaylee, you can't say that, and I've learned. So I would really love for any conservatives here hearing like what we can do to help and what we can avoid saying to make things worse.
Hi, thank you guys so much for coming tonight. And one of you had said that you were surprised about the level of vitriol that you would receive from the left. I'm a conservative, and I'm here. And I was just curious if you are surprised at maybe the support that you've received from the other side of the aisle. I know somebody touched on that earlier, but I just wanted to know if you guys are encouraged or surprised by the crossover that we have in this arena. I mean, we may disagree on probably maybe everything else, but the one thing that we do agree on is this.
So this is a hot water issue to end on. Actually, I'm going to end on something even more hot and bothered than this one, but the issue that I'm bringing up here is not the racial issue. The issue that I'm bringing up here is the progress of intersectionality to gum up the works of any progressive movement. And if you look at how the young black woman, we can completely disregard the content and just look at the form of what she's proposing. What are you doing for me? How are you bringing me to the table? Whereas the two conservative women, they don't bring up their identity. Neither of them bring up their identity. They say, what can we do for you? And are you appreciative of what we are doing for you? And I wonder if that isn't the clue of how to right the progressive ship, to return to a JFK, ask not what your intersectional activist community can do for you, ask what you can do for it. Ask what you can do for your community. Ask how you can serve. Okay, now that's that. I'm gonna end with probably the most hilarious part of the evening, and then I'll just say goodbye right now. Night.
My name is Alex Zimmerman, and I have very small question. Very small question. We have 2 senator women for 25 years. We have 7 women in Seattle Council. We have police women. We have sheriff women. We have too many women. Where is women discrimination in Seattle? Can you find me? Huh? Come on, guys.
You're really cute to stand up at a women's rally and say that.
I
It's
have
adorable.
Shut up! I have 11
So you're over time. Way more than three sentences. Thank you.
Yes, so what's happened? I'm ready.
Have a seat, please.
You fucking idiot, don't understand what has happened here? They are Nazis. They are ordinary Nazis. Go, baby, go. Exactly. Because I have different opinion. Exactly.
You're done, dude.
You not answer my question. You not answer my question. Shut up. What means shut up? They supposed to be answered. No. They supposed to be answering my question. Bye-bye, Nazi pig. Bye-bye, Nazi pig.
Nazi bitches.
Just
Let's
a
answer
good
the
old-fashioned sexist.
Is this centered around the bathroom policy of Wolf, or is this a broader push that Wolf is trying to do to be trans exclusionary?
As far as I know, it's a broader push. I wasn't paying much attention to the specific policies.
It's not about specific, just the general.
I don't know what the meeting is about.